Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. Europe's populists have been celebrating Trump's inauguration. Viktor Orban and Geert Wilders have tweeted congratulations, and Giorgia Meloni even made the pilgrimage to Maralago before the new year. But as Trump brings out the tariff sharpie, not everyone is likely to be happy for long. We're joined by Catherine Fieschi, who is a Robert Schuman, an academic at the European University Institute in Florence, and an expert on populism in Europe. Hello and welcome, Catherine.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. I shall say that again. You are a Robert Schuman Centre Fellow.
That's it.
Sorry about that. The first question is, what have been the reactions since Trump was elected, and obviously around the inauguration as well?
Right. Well, I think it's a really interesting question because the way in which Trump's election was often framed is that it would be sort of Christmas come early for all these populists, and there's no doubt that for some of them, particularly for Orban, but also for Fico in the Slovak Republic, they are genuinely thrilled that Trump has been elected. I think that for the others, we have to ask ourselves, a few questions. I think that Macron referred to this was going to be sort of a reactionary international. But for many of these populist leaders, whether it's Marine Le Pen, for instance, or even Giorgia Meloni, they probably are slightly more mitigated in their view of whether Trump is a 100% good thing for them. If you take somebody like Marine Le Pen, it's clear that for her, actually, the role of the United States in the world, and particularly a bigged up United States in the world, is not something that as a French nationalist, she's going to be very at ease with. She would have been, I think, much happier with a weaker Kamala Harris administration. Meloni is a really interesting one in all of this because she had obviously struck up a very good relationship, gone out of her way to strike up a very good relationship with Ursula von der Leyen, really made herself out to be the figurehead for a different kind of Europe. And quite frankly, even though she purports to be, very much in favor of Trump and the Trump administration, and as you say, she made the pilgrimage there, she's going to try and maybe bridge, and bridge the gap between the EU and the US. She's been trying to do this in part through her relationship with Elon Musk, but she's going to be in a difficult situation, right? There's going to be a trade-off for her in terms of being, playing by the rules and being seen to be, a trustworthy, if challenging partner in the EU, or whether she is going to align with Trump. And you can see that for Giorgia Meloni at the moment, she's trying to figure out how she's going to navigate something that is going to be more, a little bit trickier for her than it was under Biden.
It's a really tricky situation, isn't it? I mean, the obvious thing is that Europe is one trading bloc, and the biggest problem is really about trade. At least let's just focus on, I'm going to put Russia and what happens in Ukraine to one side. But in terms of people's economic well-being, the prospect of tariffs on European goods is really serious.
It's very serious, and it's also serious even for people who purport to be fully on board with Trump. I mean, if we think of Orban, for example, Hungary's largest foreign direct investor is actually China. How is Orban going to deal with the demands that the Trump administration and Trump very personally is going to place on Europe vis-a-vis its relationship with China? So even the people who are most enthusiastic about Trump's accession to power are going to have to deal with trade implications and with tariff implications. And it's quite clear that this isn't just about the populists. It's going to be a huge issue for the EU as a whole, and there are a lot of questions that we can ask about how the EU is going to deal with that.
Well, let's just talk about that then. So we know that there's a trade imbalance for roughly around $15 billion. So Europe sells more goods to the US than the other way around. And that's what Trump is angry about. He's made statements before, but he doesn't want to see a single Mercedes on the streets of New York anymore. I've just learned that there are quite a few Mercedes built in Alabama. So it may be more complex than he thinks, or I knew. How do you respond to this? I mean, the tariff wars, the European Union could very easily slap tariffs back on US goods. And they did do this a bit first time round.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a whole series of questions that need to be asked, right? The first one being whether he's really going to do this to Europe. It's quite interesting that in his inaugural speech and in terms of, what he's been doing in these sort of manic 24 hours, since he's given the speech, the tariffs that he's chosen to land first are on the US and Mexico, huge tariffs. And we know that he's basically weaponizing these tariffs to, as a means to, as a way of pressuring Canada and Mexico into going along with his immigration priorities. Quite interesting that, really, Europe barely got a mention, in the inaugural speech and even in the overflow speech, right? So the first question that we have to ask ourselves is, will he do it? I mean, does Europe matter at all to him? Beyond the rhetoric that he uses, the fact that there's this trade imbalance and that, Americans are busy making Europeans rich rather than the other way around. That's a very effective rhetorical device. Let's see how far he really goes into these tariffs. Then I think that we need to ask the question about the reactions at the EU level. I mean, the Commission having responsibility for trade agreements in particular, and individual countries. I think it's interesting that von der Leyen yesterday or the day before, when she gave her speech in Davos, went out of her way to send a very clear signal about the fact that Europe was doing very well in terms of trade and trade agreements. She touted the recently signed Mercosur agreement. There's many a twist, between cup and lip on this one, but still, there was a big step taken forward on Mercosur. So she extolled this model. And she also was very clear about the fact that Europe was going to continue to have a relationship with China, to continue to negotiate with China and try to find a way forward with China. I think it was a very clear signal that Europe wasn't ready to just kowtow to American diktat. They didn't do it under Biden, and they don't seem to be ready to do it really under Trump. Then, there's the reality of it and the fact that there is going to be huge temptation. If Trump slaps these tariffs, the two types of temptations. One is to actually cave in on the part of European manufacturers and move across and actually make the most of any incentives that remain from the IRA, cheap energy prices, essentially building these goods in the US. And then there's going to be the temptation for some European member states to try and carve out separate deals. And I think that, this is where the danger comes in for the EU. Can it remain united? Can it speak with one voice? Or will, in fact, the siren song of American incentives and American power actually gradually undermine its capacity to do that? And you can imagine Meloni maybe striking a bit of a deal. You can imagine Orban trying to do that. But, this takes me back to my first point. How interested is Trump really in Europe? And I still have a question mark over that. It seems to me he's very focused on the US and the Americas. And of course, the Pacific.
Are you sort of imagining it as just things could sort of bubble on? It's not going to. It doesn't have to be a big focus of conflict. Is that what you're saying?
I think that there's going to, Europe is trailing behind the U.S. in a major way, and Trump isn't going to help that. We know that in terms of tech and AI and certainly defense, we are not producing and we're not delivering the growth. We're not almost incomparable sets with the United States since, certainly a good 10 years. So I think that was a problem before, and it's going to continue to be a problem under Trump. I think Trump, on the other hand, is going to place us in a situation where we will have to make some choices. But in a sense, I don't know that he's going to, I think he's going to be transactional in the way that he always is. If you want to continue to benefit from the American security guarantee, you're going to have to invest more money. And he knows that that means buying more weapons, for example, from the United States. I think it's going to be, as simple as that. So it's not so much, trundling along as possibly a worsening of the situation that we already found ourselves in as Europeans, even under Biden and even under Obama.
Yeah, a definite shift away. Christine Lagarde talks about having a checkbook strategy and says that it'll be ill-advised to go down the tariffs route. You've highlighted that obviously there's Commission on Trade strategy and how you deal with tariffs and a tariff policy. I'm just trying to envisage. I mean, you can. It's down to individual governments to buy stuff like gas contracts, weapons, agriculture, that kind of thing. So that's how much of this can be done. If Meloni can strike her own deal, what can she expect to get from that? Macron, who knows how long he's going to be around for. Can how much, to what extent can he buy off the US? I'm trying to get the difference between European strategy and what these individual countries might be able to do.
So I think that there's a couple of things here. I think that Trump, and certainly the way that we've discussed Trump as Europeans during the campaign and in the run-up to the election, we focused on. We used Trump's vocabulary about, tariffs against Europe and against European countries. I think that, one of the things that we're going to see is probably actually on the part of the United States, much more targeted approaches, basically singling out certain products, certain sectors in certain countries. So you can very well imagine Macron having a conversation, much as he'd done in the past with Trump, about French luxury goods or French cognac, or and Trump retaliating with Harley Davidson. I think that to some extent there's still going to be a lot of that on that level. And then I think that there is the other level, which is more EU. And one of the things that Trump is very likely to demand is in exchange for American security and protection and America's continued role in NATO, he's going to ask for counterparts. And one of the key ones that I suspect he's going to go for is access to the European agricultural market. And this is really going to be, extremely difficult for certain European countries. France, which is the biggest recipient of CAP, but also Poland, for sure. To some extent, Italy, and this is also symbolically. This is also a sector that carries symbolic weight. We all remember the discussions around Brexit about the Americans sending chlorinated chicken, and this sense in which Europe, the Europeans try to maintain certain levels in agricultural production and quality of foodstuffs, and this giving in on this is going to give rise to an enormous discussion at the EU level, and I I think it's going to be one of the principal targets of the Trump administration, and that is, the opening up the huge European agricultural market to U.S. products.
Well, that's politically, I mean, for domestic politics, that's very contentious, isn't it?
Hugely contentious. I mean, more in some places than in others, but in some key European economies and polities, as I said, France, Poland, in particular, these are the sorts of this is an issue that would inflame the public, and this is when we're going to see some real difficulties between some Trump and someone like Marine Le Pen, whose voter base in the agricultural sector, in the farming community, is very, very strong. This would be a perfect example of where the rubber is going to hit the road and going to be very problematic for Marine Le Pen.
What's the timing of the next presidential election? I'm just trying to think if you've got a Marine Le Pen as president, So
the timing, which is somewhat provisional at this point, is 2027, and it's going to be a long and complicated road to that. Marine Le Pen is as you and some of our listeners may know, is in the middle of a trial. There will be a verdict at the end of March. She may be ineligible, for elections for a few years. So no one really knows what's going to happen, and 2027 feels like a really long time away with a weak president. However, even before that, if Trump makes any moves, she will have to come out fighting on the part of French agriculture and French farmers. And I suspect that this kind of situation is going to repeat itself in one sector or another, in one way or another, in various places where the populists are in powers, and where, quite frankly, given that, essentially they are nationalists, their own national pursuits and their claim to protect the nation will really, come into conflict with anything that Trump demands.
A point very, very well made. The biggest and possibly the most obvious point of contention is slightly outside the EU's remit, but not, and that's really Ukraine. And I guess we know that the United States has said that they will produce a truce. The implications of that are a settlement that the Ukraine might not want, Europe might not want, or a United States that's not going to provide the military and security guarantees that both Europe and Ukraine desire to defend themselves against Russia. So this is really, really worrying stuff. But if I were to guess at anything, there might be a slight silver lining in that you've got to rearm yourselves and you've got to buy some of that kit from Russia. Not from Russia, from the United States.
I don't think we'll be doing that.
Yeah, not from Russia. Yeah.
No, I think that when it comes to Ukraine, one of the great fears in Europe, I mean, there is, of course, the idea that the United States will force the kind of settlement that you've just outlined, and in a sense, it doesn't resolve anything. It's a precarious peace. It's not even a peace. It's going to be an extended ceasefire of sorts between Russia and Ukraine. So that doesn't make the Ukrainians happy. I think the big fear in Europe is that ensuring what would be a large demilitarized zone, and in a sense ensuring Ukraine's security, but also the security of the Baltics, etc. That this will demand, first of all, a lot of European money, which, as we know, hasn't been particularly forthcoming. It's come, in dribs and drabs, but the fact is that Europe, hasn't really pulled its weight in this respect. But I think that the greatest fear is possibly that as a result of this, in a sense, the message from the US is this is Europe's problem, sort yourselves out. It doesn't mean that that the US play a less prominent role in NATO. It doesn't necessarily, completely upend the current security architecture. But what it does do is leave Europe to deal with this conflict more or less on its own and in a position of weakness. One of the things that, as you say, is the silver lining, both for Europe and in a sense for the US, is that Europe has to continue to arm itself in order to shoulder that responsibility. It's probably it definitely needs to go down that road in any case. And for the US, it does mean that Europe will not only be buying more liquid natural gas from the US, but also more weapons. So for the US, this is a win-win. It's a kind of a problem, off their sheet. Freedom to continue to pivot to Asia, for Trump to devote himself to his number one obsession with it, which is China, and at the same time, more contract for U.S. defense providers.
Let's have some questions, please. I can see people in Houston. I can see them in DC. I think it's possibly too late for Australia. It's midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning in Wellington. So if anyone's there, I'd be really delighted. But please do put your questions in, even the Netherlands as well. So do get your questions in quickly, and then we can put them to Catherine. So Alan Livingston, we've got you there. Go ahead, Alan. Just open your microphone and go ahead.
Two questions. Number one, you mentioned LNG, and I wondered how much more can Europe substantially increase its purchase of American LNG, which would help to lower the so-called Trump deficit. And the second question, is there a way where Europe can increase its growth rate? It's been stagnant for so long. I'm just wondering whether or not there are ways that it can stimulate its own economies.
If someone's got the answer to that, they're going to make a lot of money, Alan. The last
question. Shall I take it directly?
Yeah, go on.
Okay. So I guess I'd start with question number 2. I do think that that the Draghi report that was published a few months ago did give us some ways forward in this respect. His emphasis on more coordinated investments, more into innovation in particular, but also consolidating some of the key structures in the European Union, consolidating the various European markets in particular. Part of Europe's weakness is Europe's continued fragmentation, to some extent on financial markets, because our financial markets aren't large enough and too fragmented. The continued fragmentation in fiscal policy, which also, in a sense, prevents European Union institutions from having the right levers at its disposal. And of course, Draghi really focused on the kinds of innovation that Europe needs to pursue. And he's interesting in this respect because he says that we're stuck in a medium innovation trap, right? So to some extent, Europe is having difficulty, making it into the big leagues in terms of investment, in particular in artificial intelligence. And I just saw the announcement yesterday by OpenAI of the new Stargate project, new huge open AI projects, 500 billion. This is the scale at which these innovations need to be played. And I think that Europe isn't there. You're absolutely right. It's only through scaling up in this way that it will improve its growth. And I do think that the Draghi report, gave very valuable advice. But I fear it may well end up, propping up the stereo speakers of of a variety of EU officials. And yet, I think the advice is pretty clear. In terms of LNG, I think it's a really good question, because I think that the Europeans are asking themselves the same question. They're of course, since the Russia-Ukraine route for gas, came to a final halt, they've had to continue to diversify their purchases. The US and Norway are, for most of the Europeans, top suppliers, and there's Qatar and Azerbaijan, depending on where you look. But as you say, the imports are already colossal. And the question that is being asked also is the fact that actually, in terms of renewables, and in some places, because of the production of, for example, French nuclear energy, actually the gas, given the European energy market, gas is the most expensive source of electricity. So that most European nations, whether they have nuclear production of energy or not, are asking whether a combination of renewables and some nuclear being produced by France and a number of others isn't the way forward. A much cheaper way, right, than continuing to buy US LNG. But I suspect that certainly in the next 2 years, what we will see is potentially the LNG purchases from the US being used, in a sense, as a goodwill gesture toward the Trump administration. In a sense, almost for the sake of the symbolism of these purchases, to keep the dialogue open with the US. But financially, and also from the point of view of Europe's energy mix, it doesn't really make much sense going forward.
Yeah, very interesting, very interesting. Howard Gatis, nice provocative question, please.
Good morning, good afternoon. I think it's a salutary lesson for those of us listening to what's been said in Europe, when you say that actually he probably doesn't care or spend all that much time thinking about Europe anyway. I think we always still like to think we must be top of the agenda, and I think you're right to highlight that that's probably not the case anymore. If he doesn't care about us, does he care about Taiwan?
Yes. I think he does, only insofar as Taiwan is in the orbit of his, as I said, I think his major obsession. Trump's view of the world, which has become, clearer, even clearer between the moment he was elected and the moment he was inaugurated, is quite interesting, because somebody pointed out to me, Michael Ignatieff, who's a good connoisseur of these issues, pointed out to me that Trump really has a very old-fashioned, almost 19th century view of the world. If he thinks of the Americas, and one of the issues, and I say this as a Canadian, of having Canada as a 51st state, and then the issue of Panama, how he sees the relationship with South America. It's a strangely continental view, but also a view. If you think of the Panama Canal, it's all about maritime routes. It's a strangely old-fashioned, well, not so strange given his age, I suppose, but it's somewhat old-fashioned view of the world, with that dollop of American isolationism, which he's by no means the first to put forward. On the other hand, you have to contrast that with someone who really feels that all of the danger in the world is coming from China. That essentially it's a fight to the death between the US US and China. It's a technological fight. It's a prosperity fight. It's a fight between values. And I think that therefore, even though in some ways it doesn't make any sense to care about Taiwan if he doesn't much care about Europe, I do think that there's a logic there in the sense that I would argue that his preoccupation with China is somewhat obsessive.
Yeah.
So if I'm allowed a supplementary, so would that include if China sort of started to make serious military moves? Would that go so far as then to getting involved militarily?
I mean, whether Trump is going to break that, the time-honored, what is it called again? Not constructive, I think constructive ambiguity with respect to Taiwan. I mean, ambiguity has never been Trump's strong suit, so I have a feeling he may have difficulty sticking to that. My sense is that, when he says to Israel and to Hamas, there will be hell to pay if this doesn't get sorted out. I would imagine that he will use exactly the same vocabulary with China over Taiwan. And he may very well find himself, I think, embroiled militarily. I think that is the one area where I don't see a pullback, and where I think either through calculation or through spectacular miscalculation, that isn't, I would say it's not off the table.
Yeah, shocking stuff. You mentioned Greenland. I do wonder if Greenland, which looks larger than Africa, or as big as Africa on Mercator's map, just looks like really nice big territory to have for not a lot of cost. Yeah.
I think so. I think partly it's a cheap way of needling Europe. Just like the 51st state and Trudeau as governor is a cheap way of needling Canada. I think that one of the clearest one of the hallmarks of Trump is the fact that his view of allies is really much more about having vassals than allies. That doesn't mean that he doesn't sort of accidentally or de facto have a relationship that may benefit these allies. But really, I think we're talking about a vassalization, whether it's a vassalization of Greenland or the vassalization of Europe. I think that this is the big geopolitical transformation, a fundamental reconfiguration of what these relationships are, which is that he will exploit dependence.
Yeah.
And in the case of Greenland and other factors, like, for example, European agricultural market, he will grab what he can. So it's not quite plundering, but I would call it vassalization, really.
Yeah. I mean, the post-Second World War order, the post since 1989, all of these things are just being torn up, which brings me back to Europe itself and where it's going. It's a tremendously bureaucratic structure. You have these populists who have come to the fore. You've seen Brexit. All these things would suggest that there's a very sort of febrile, uncertain sense of where Europe's going, the threat from Russia as well. Do you have hopes at the same time? There's a necessity to pull together. There's a necessity to deal with defence. There's a necessity to deal with Trump. So I'm looking for some positive points as well as the negatives.
Well, I'll do my best. I actually think that there are positive points. Of course, we have to take note of the fact that in a number of European countries, clearly deeply Eurosceptic and at least superficially pro-Trump, governments are coming into being, and we've just added Austria to this list recently. So I think that there is the fact that we will be faced with a European Council where there are fewer and fewer heads of government that are unadulterately pro-European. I think this is problematic, because this is where some of the bigger, obviously the bigger decisions get made. So there is this fragmentation. Two things at least give me hope. One is that some of these leaders will have to reckon with, the difficulties that Trump presents for them. And this is going to come, in my sense, after a lot of symbolic kowtowing and chumminess. That's going to come, quicker than we think. The other thing that gives me hope is the fact that for all the accusations of control freakery and, power centralization that have been leveled at Ursula von der Leyen, I think she has a good measure of what Europe can do and what Europe needs to do, and also how to do it. I think the fact that, she did everything she could to bring the Mercosur agreement to a close before Trump's election. The fact that she has tried to Trump-proof Europe, in some ways, and is a clever politician who knows how to wield both sticks and carrots. I think, that this really gives me hope. And then I suppose my last hope is that, yes, the European institutions are highly bureaucratic, even though some of them are becoming increasingly politicized. That's clear. The European Parliament has shifted to the right since June, and the European Council has also shifted to the right. But the fact is that the European Commission and many of the organizations that make up this Brussels nebula, they are indeed super bureaucratic, but bureaucracy can be a force in this instance. I think, for those who resent the deep state, it's an obstacle. But, when it comes to consolidating, what the Europeans called their acquis, in a way, it really is a tanker to turn around. And so I think that to some extent there may not be, innovation and adaptation, and it's not nimble, but I think it is more resilient than many give it credit for, including through some of its most maddening features, which is the levels of bureaucracy. And I have a feeling that, we're going to be thankful for the fact that the bureaucracy is holding back some of these tides.
I think you've just preempted, Hilary Matthews' question, but Hilary, go ahead with your question anyway.
Yes, I think you have actually pretty much answered it, but my question was, given the trade imbalance that you mentioned earlier between the US and the EU, why on earth should the EU feel the need to placate Trump or play his game? Surely the EU is in a strong enough position to call the shots, at least as far as trade and agriculture is concerned.
I think that's right. There's two things I would say. One is that I think the EU can call the shots. But I do think, we still have, as I was saying earlier, some parts of Europe that are very poorly, parts of the European market that are very poorly integrated, which means that there is still going to be a temptation for, for deals, for bilateral deals. And Trump is going to exploit that. And his trade representative, Jameson, I think it is, will exploit that to the hilt. And it only takes a few of these bilateral deals to actually, I think, shake the credibility of partly shake the credibility of the EU. The second thing is that the Achilles heel and what will place Europe in a situation where it will feel it has to kowtow to some extent is its defense weakness. And and in the end, it will come down to that. For as long as there is a regime in Russia that wields, a more than credible threat, then I think that the Europeans will feel that they have to, they certainly have to pull their weight more in NATO, which some of them have begun to do, and some of them have begun to do in spades, like Poland, that's increased its spending, not to 2 but to 4.5% of its GDP on defense. But for as long as there is, in particular, I think the threat from Russia, and Europe just doesn't have really the defense capacity, to face it or even enforce a poor solution that might have been concocted by Trump and Putin, then I think it is in a relationship of dependence to the United States, and that's going to forever hold it back from calling the shots unless it gets its act together much more seriously.
Catherine, we're going to wrap up in just a bit. Some really good questions. I really enjoyed this. But before we go, I just want you to talk a bit about some of your work that you're focusing at the moment. Giorgia Meloni is a big focus for you. You look at populism. You've followed populism in Europe for some time. I just want to. Can you talk a bit about Meloni and? Can you? What makes her different from Marine Le Pen? I mean, she came in. We're going to Italy in April. We're doing a tour that's looking at her and populism. She came when she ran for office. She was a Eurosceptic and pro-Russia. Now she's pretty critical of Russia and certainly doing very well working with the Commission. What's this woman all about?
Well, that's a very good question. And it's true. I'm spending a lot of time on Giorgia Meloni, A, because she's fascinating, and B, because I'm writing a book about women in the far right. So I am spending a lot of time on her. She's an extremely interesting character because I think that she's the leader of a party that is the indirect heir of a fascist party. And so when she was elected, there was a great frisson that really shook Europe with finding
the brothers of Italy, direct descendants of Mussolini's own party.
Exactly, and so there was real fear that she would be another version of Orban. It turns out that actually, first of all, she's a more clever politician than many of the others. I don't necessarily mean more clever than Orban, who has maintained himself in power for, over a decade now. But if I compare her to somebody like Marine Le Pen, I think, this is a woman who has a much deeper knowledge. She's not just been in politics, unlike Le Pen. She's actually been in ministerial posts in the past, small ministerial posts, but nevertheless, she was Minister for Youth. She was Undersecretary of State at one point for Culture. So this is somebody who really knows the way the Italian system works and also where it doesn't work. And therefore, I think, she's a much more credible leader. The other thing that is important to keep in mind about Meloni is that she came on the heels of Mario Draghi. Mario Draghi had done a lot to return Italy to a level of financial and economic credibility. He had done everything he could for Italy to benefit from the massive European recovery package post-COVID. And Meloni realized that in order to continue to secure the money for Italy and to basically deliver on the very expensive promises that she'd made, she needed to continue Draghi's trajectory. And so to some extent, this is when I say that Europe has gotten better at this, it is quite clear that Europe and somebody like von der Leyen, they've gotten much better at basically saying, you only get the cash if you toe the line. That is not a form of glorious politics, but it turns out to be pretty effective,
to a degree. Viktor Orban seems to have got away with a massive amount and prime pumped his economy, taken over the media, taken over the entire economy without much of a rap over his knuckles.
Well, I mean, actually, he's short, several tens of millions, that haven't been delivered to him. But I also think that, Meloni has a different ambition for Italy. She has, and Italy is Italy's status as a founding member of the European Union, means that, for Meloni, what's important is not for Italy to be rogue within Europe. What's important is for Italy to set the tone in Europe. This is her dream, a kind of a powerful, respectable, credible Italy that brings a number of solutions to the table, however distasteful, for example, on the immigration front. But what she wants is slightly different from Orban. She does not want Italy to be thought of as rogue. She wants Italy to be thought of as right at the heart of Europe and a critically important member of the European Union. And in that respect, Italy's has a bit of a chip on its shoulder, always being sort of the third wheel to France and Germany. And I think Meloni's aim and Meloni's guiding principles are to achieve that, and that means that she's much more cooperative on a number of issues.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I hope we can see you in April. We'll try and see if we can work on that and make that happen. It'd be great to see you there. I've really enjoyed the discussion. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you. It was great to be here. Thank you.